May 4, 1945. Berchtesgaden, Bavarian Alps, southern Germany. The mountain air, usually crisp and clean, was thick with the acrid smell of high explosive smoke and pulverized limestone. Below the peaks of the Hoher Gall, a terrible, beautiful light show was finally dying out. The roar of the North American B-25 Mitchell bombers, which had pounded this Nazi sanctuary less than a week earlier, had been replaced by the rhythmic clatter of tank treads and the exhausted, low murmur of American GIs. Staff Sergeant George Gallagher, a lean 30-year-old infantryman from the 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment PIR of the 101st Airborne Division, shifted the weight of his M1 Garand and sucked a lungful of the cold air. Beside him, Private First Class Tony Rizzo swore under his breath, adjusting the strap of the Bar Browning automatic rifle, digging into his shoulder. "Look at this mess, Sarge," Rizzo muttered, nodding toward what had been the grand resort town of Berchtesgaden. The streets were choked with rubble, the distinctive black timber framing of the Bavarian homes shattered by the Allied bombardment. This was ground zero for the Obersalzberg complex, the sprawling, semi-secret network of compounds, bunkers, and chalets where the Third Reich's most powerful men, Goering, Bormann, and most importantly the Führer himself, had planned the war that had consumed the world. The objective was not the town, but what loomed above it, the jagged, seemingly impenetrable peak of the Kehlstein, and, specifically, the retreat perched precariously upon it. The Kehlsteinhaus, the infamous eagle's nest, a gift to Adolf Hitler for his 50th birthday, a place of almost mythical significance that had been the ultimate prize in the race for southern Germany. The American 101st Airborne, the famed Screaming Eagles, had clawed their way into the valley, only to find they had company. A column of French armored vehicles, specifically elements of the 2nd Armored Division, 2E Division Blindé, under the legendary General Leclerc, were already moving through the passes. The race to capture Hitler's lair had come down to American paratroopers and French tanks, both determined to claim the symbolic victory. Gallagher watched a French M4 Sherman tank, adorned with the Free French Cross of Lorraine, rumble past. The competition was fierce, fueled by pride and the desire for the ultimate war trophy. "Doesn't matter who got here first, Rizzo," Gallagher said, his voice flat with fatigue. "The Krauts are still dug in higher up. The whole damn thing's a fortress." The intelligence reports were confusing and contradictory. Some suggested the complex had been stripped and abandoned, others that it was still heavily guarded by fanatical SS holdouts. The paratroopers knew the one thing they couldn't afford to do was assume it was safe. The road up the mountain was a serpentine, one-lane ascent, carved almost vertically out of the sheer rock face. They moved toward the base of the access tunnel, the only way to reach the mountain retreat, their weapons held ready. The Obersalzberg was quiet now, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The biggest discovery, the unbelievable secret, was not in the valley. It was waiting high above, untouched and shielded, hidden from the bombs and the mud, a preserved monument to the luxury and lunacy of a defeated empire. The men of the 506th PIR reached the base of the Kehlstein complex and halted. They were met not by gunfire, but by an imposing structure, a massive, ornate entrance cut into the rock face. This wasn't a military bunker. It was a grand architectural gesture. High above, they could make out the silhouette of the Kehlsteinhaus itself, clinging to the peak like an eyrie. The American objective was clear: secure the summit. Captain Richard "Dick" Winters, commanding the lead elements of the 2nd Battalion, consulted the crude map sketches they had been provided. "All right, Sarge Rizzo," he addressed Gallagher and the team. "This entrance leads to a long tunnel. It's the only way up. Could be booby-trapped, could be mined. We proceed slow. Maximum caution. We're not taking casualties this late in the game for a souvenir hunt." They pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The tunnel was immediately disorienting. Instead of rough-hewn rock and bare concrete, the walls were lined with polished marble. Lighting fixtures, though some were broken from the nearby bombings, were heavy brass and surprisingly elegant. The floor, slick with dampness and scattered debris, echoed their footsteps, magnifying every scrape of leather on stone, every metallic click of a rifle safety being carefully checked. The air was frigid, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone and stale dust. The tunnel ran nearly 124 meters, 406 feet, straight into the mountain's core, maintaining a slight, unnerving incline. Every shadow seemed to conceal a waiting enemy. Staff Sergeant Gallagher, leading the point team, kept his M1 Garand aimed low, sweeping the floor for tripwires or pressure plates. His eyes, trained by months of brutal combat across France and the Ardennes, constantly sought the unnatural. A disturbed rock, a taut wire. The silence was the worst kind of suspense. In a complex this important, constructed for a man this paranoid, they expected traps. They expected a last, desperate stand. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a large, circular chamber. In the center, dominating the space, was an elevator shaft, the final, vertical ascent to the eagle's nest. The elevator doors were made of burnished brass, deeply embossed with geometric patterns, and gleamed even in the weak light filtering down the shaft. It was lavish, theatrical, and utterly out of place for a nation collapsing under the weight of its own megalomania. Two figures emerged from the shadows near the elevator controls. They were French soldiers, specifically from a reconnaissance platoon of the Regiment de Marque du Chad, part of Leclerc's 2nd Armored. They looked as stunned as the Americans, standing guard over the silent, ornate chamber. A French lieutenant, sharp-eyed and weary, stepped forward.
Bonjour, Américain.
We secured this access point an hour ago. No resistance, surprisingly. The last guards fled down the service passages when they heard the tanks. He gestured toward the brass doors. The lift works, but we have held position. We are waiting for orders before taking the summit itself. We wished for no misunderstandings. The race was now a joint, cautious effort. The prize was just one elevator ride away, 120 meters, 400 feet, above their heads. Previous_section_text. The race was now a joint, cautious effort. The prize was just one elevator ride away, 120 meters, 400 feet, above their heads. Section 3. The Gilded Cage. Captain Winters exchanged crisp pleasantries with the French lieutenant, confirming their joint objective. This final leg of the journey was too symbolic, too potentially dangerous, to be left to territorial squabbling. The Americans would take the lead in the elevator. The French would follow immediately. "All right, let's go," Winters commanded, nodding toward the gleaming brass doors. Gallagher, Rizzo, and two other men from the 506th PIR stepped onto the plush, carpeted floor of the elevator car. The car itself was an artifact of staggering, almost obscene luxury. The walls were lined with polished Venetian mirrors. The fittings were heavy, decorative gold-plated brass. Even the air inside felt different, stale, undisturbed, and overwhelmingly rich. It was a golden, vertical coffin designed for a tyrant. As the elevator began its smooth, silent ascent, the American soldiers were transfixed, their faces reflected in the mirrored walls alongside their mud-caked M1943 field jackets and dirty helmets. The movement was so gentle, the mechanism so flawless, it was utterly disconnected from the sounds of war raging only a few miles away. Rizzo whistled softly, a sound instantly stifled by the atmosphere of the car. "Can you believe this?" Rizzo whispered to Gallagher, gripping his bar tighter. "They're starving people down in Munich, and this place looks like something out of a goddamn palace." "They built it for a god," Gallagher responded, his voice barely audible. He was focused on the top of the car, watching for any sign of a concealed enemy position or a wire leading to a demolition charge. The ascent felt interminable, a dramatic pause before the final scene. They were moving into the enemy's innermost sanctum, and the overwhelming opulence only amplified the tension. This was not the bunker logic of the Führer bunker. This was theater, a stage set for ultimate power. The car stopped with a barely perceptible click. The heavy brass doors slid open, revealing an entirely different world. They were standing in the heart of the Kehlsteinhaus. The light was blinding, spilling in from enormous panoramic windows that offered a dizzying view of the Alps. A vista that stretched for hundreds of miles, a geographic monument to the vast territories the Reich had once controlled. The main room was immense, a great hall built almost entirely of glass and local stone. Crucially, the room was empty. There was no sign of combat, no shell holes, and only minor, isolated damage from concussive force. It was pristine. The contrast was immediate and jarring. Below them, Berchtesgaden was a smoking ruin, a monument to the Allied air superiority. Here, 6,017 feet above sea level, everything was untouched. The furniture was heavy, crafted wood, covered in thick velvet. A large, circular fireplace dominated one wall, built of red Italian marble. An incredible sight, a place of peace and luxury, preserved perfectly while the German nation crumbled into dust. The men fanned out, their boots crunching on the spotless stone floor, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and professional apprehension. They had secured the eagle's nest, but the true significance of the find was only just beginning to unfold within its silent, wealthy walls. Previous understructure, the men fanned out, their boots crunching on the spotless stone floor, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and professional apprehension. They had secured the eagle's nest, but the true significance of the find was only just beginning to unfold within its silent, wealthy walls. Section 4. The Untouched Trophy Room. Captain Winters established a small perimeter in the main hall. They were still extremely exposed, surrounded by glass windows, but the immediate threat seemed to have evaporated. The French reconnaissance team arrived in the second elevator car. Their lieutenant, whose name was Henri Moreau, nodding gravely at the scene. "They did not even fight," Moreau observed, his voice hushed. This place was too important to them, too symbolic to risk damage. The main room, sometimes called the Great Hall or Conference Room, offered a 360-degree spectacle of the surrounding peaks. It was dominated by the enormous fireplace, the one Gallagher had noticed, a gift from Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. It was made of rare, rich red Rosso Verona marble, nearly 3 meters high, and looked as if it had been lit yesterday. Rizzo ran a gloved hand over its smooth, cold surface, shaking his head. "Wait until the boys back home hear about this rock," he muttered. A piece of Mussolini's fireplace. Can you imagine? While the soldiers guarded the entrances, Gallagher and Rizzo were tasked with a preliminary sweep of the adjacent rooms. The Kehlsteinhaus was surprisingly small, built primarily as a prestige receiving house, not a residence. It contained a kitchen, a dining room, a small study, a guest room, and guard quarters. But every single room was a testament to the Nazi regime's vast wealth and its obsession with self-mythologizing. In a small adjoining study, they found bookshelves lined not with military strategy texts, but with leather-bound volumes of German poetry and philosophy. On a heavy oak desk, a leather blotter lay undisturbed, alongside a crystal inkwell. The drawers, when carefully checked, contained only high-quality stationery bearing the official Reich Chancellery letterhead. No tactical plans, no final orders, just the administrative detritus of an absent, powerful man. The real shock came in the dining room. A long, polished mahogany table was set for perhaps 12 people. Not with silver and china, but with an astonishing array of what could only be described as high-end plunder. Stacked neatly on sideboards were cases of French champagne, specifically vintage Moët and Chandon, alongside crates marked with the insignia of exclusive cognac houses. But it was the wine cellar, located just off the main kitchen, that caused the paratroopers to stop dead. Descending a short flight of stone steps, Gallagher turned on his flashlight. The beams cut through the cool, humid air, revealing row upon row of stacked wooden racks. The cellar was not merely stocked, it was overflowing. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of bottles lay horizontally, sealed and labeled. Many bore French labels: Bordeaux, Burgundy, Côte-Rôtie. Wines that were rare and priceless, systematically looted from the finest vineyards of occupied France over 4 long years. Rizzo, momentarily forgetting his fatigue, let out a low whistle. "Sarge, this ain't a cellar. This is a goddamn museum of booze. They didn't even touch it. They were planning on coming back." The sheer quantity and quality of the undisturbed loot suggested a final, frantic evacuation where only personnel and critical documents were saved, leaving the symbols of their self-indulgence behind. A poignant, baffling contrast to the scorched earth policy elsewhere in the crumbling Reich. The untouched luxury spoke volumes about the arrogance of the men who had built this mountain fortress. The discovery of the wine cellar, a massive subterranean reservoir of French vintage, dramatically altered the mood of the initial securing force. The immediate, reflexive caution was tempered by the realization that they were no longer dealing with a military objective, but a treasure house. News of the find traveled instantly, amplified by the natural enthusiasm of tired, victorious soldiers. Captain Winters, a pragmatic officer focused on maintaining discipline, knew he had a problem. He quickly issued orders. The Kehlsteinhaus was now officially secured property of the U.S. Army. No looting was permitted until the area was fully processed by intelligence and counterintelligence personnel. But the temptation, gleaming in green glass and stamped with the seals of ancient vineyards, was overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Gallagher and Private First Class Rizzo were tasked with guarding the cellar. The air was heavy with the rich, earthy scent of aging grapes. They were surrounded by fortunes in liquid history. Rizzo, born into a working-class family in Chicago, stared at a bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1929, a vintage even the wealthy back home seldom saw. "Sarge," Rizzo whispered, holding his rifle across his chest. "Do you think anyone's gonna really stop us from having one? Just one toast? We won the war, didn't we?" Gallagher, a veteran who had seen too much death, felt the pull, but his training held firm. "We secure the objective, Rizzo. We don't steal from a dead tyrant. That's what they did." He pointed his flashlight toward the back of the cellar, noticing a pile of wooden crates stacked haphazardly, different from the neat wine racks. These crates, bearing Reich transportation tags, were hastily piled and concealed. They pried open the top crate with a bayonet. It wasn't wine. Inside, nestled in sawdust and straw, were heavy, ornate silver dishes, platters, and chalices, clearly ceremonial or religious objects, many bearing hallmarks that suggested they were looted from institutions across Europe. Another crate held a collection of fine European paintings, rolled tightly and wrapped in oilcloth, obviously priceless. The Kehlsteinhaus wasn't just a mountain retreat. It was a high-altitude vault, a final repository for the most valuable, portable spoils of the war, a reserve built by men who expected to enjoy their victory in perpetuity. The soldiers were standing knee-deep in proof of the organized, systematic thievery that had financed the Nazi war machine. The opulence was a sickening testament to the scale of their crimes. Soon, other U.S. and French units began to arrive on the summit, drawn by the reports of the untouched building. French units from the 2EDB were particularly driven, having a personal score to settle with the German plunderers. General Leclerc himself had famously instructed his troops to capture Berchtesgaden to reclaim French property and national honor. The shared sense of discovery and vindication momentarily transcended the recent rivalry between the Allies. They had captured the symbolic heart of the Nazi conspiracy, and the immediate reward was a window into the extent of its monstrous wealth. With the initial securing of the perimeter complete and the vast stores of liquor and looted art inventoried, the focus shifted to the intelligence value of the location. Captain Winters, now joined by Major Bill Driesbach, the acting intelligence officer for the 506th PIR, began a meticulous search for documents. The discovery of the material wealth was stunning, but the paper trail was the ultimate prize. The Kehlsteinhaus, designed primarily for formal receptions, had few dedicated administrative areas. The search concentrated on the smaller study and the guard quarters. What they found suggested a very late, hasty evacuation. In a desk drawer in the study, underneath the luxurious stationery, Major Driesbach pulled out a sealed file bearing the unmistakable SS runes. The contents were mundane but critical. Disbursement records for the maintenance of the Obersalzberg complex, including coded payroll documents for the staff and the SS security detachment, the SS Begleitkommando des Führers. These papers would provide invaluable links in tracing the inner circle and their remaining networks. Meanwhile, the French soldiers, driven by a deep sense of retrieval, were not idle. Lieutenant Moreau and his men were carefully tagging the crates of wine. The French focus was less on the payroll records and more on immediate tangible justice. As they inventoried the champagne, they noticed a particular type of bottle, a rare vintage of rose champagne, specifically Dom Perignon 1943. It was one of Hitler's favorite types, reportedly preferred for his intimate gatherings. Sergeant Marcel Dubois of the 2EDB, a Parisian whose own family vineyard had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht, held up a bottle. The sight of the luxurious, pink-hued liquid, spared the bombs and the mud, seemed to trigger a collective feeling of deep, righteous anger among the French troops. The juxtaposition of this delicate, frivolous drink with the vast atrocities orchestrated by the man who drank it was too much. This was when the discipline, so fiercely maintained, began to fray. The troops, both American and French, had faced unimaginable hardship. They were exhausted, mentally scarred, and had just fought their way to the symbolic last stand of the Nazi regime. The sheer, overwhelming irony of the situation, the conquerors surrounded by the spoils of the defeated, eroded the remaining military stiffness. A French corporal, Etienne, broke the tension. He approached Major Driesbach, holding 2 bottles of the finest French brandy, Cognac Grande Champagne. He uncorked one with a flourish and offered it to the American major. "Major," he said, his voice ringing slightly with defiance and triumph. "This is French property. We are liberating it. You are our allies. We celebrate the victory now."
À la victoire.
The major hesitated for only a second. The war was over for all intents and purposes. Discipline in the face of such profound victory and such staggering temptation was a moral choice, not a military necessity. Driesbach took the bottle. The sound of uncorking became widespread. The silence of the pristine mountain sanctuary was broken by a wave of raucous, cathartic celebration. A bizarre and unforgettable victory party held in the golden cage of the enemy. The formal military discipline dissolved into a scene of chaotic, yet joyous, reclaiming. Soldiers who had been surviving on K rations for weeks were now carefully handling glasses of vintage French wine. The vast, panoramic windows of the Great Hall, which had been designed to project power and superiority, now framed the victorious American and French soldiers as they surveyed the valleys below. Staff Sergeant Gallagher finally allowed himself a small measure of relief. He sat on the edge of a velvet-covered sofa, its rich fabric ironically untouched by the mud and grime of the war, and nursed a cup of tepid coffee. Private Rizzo, however, was in the wine cellar, having been reassigned by Captain Winters to continue the inventory of the French brandy stocks, a thinly veiled acknowledgement of the moment. The centerpiece of the hall, the massive red Rosso Verona marble fireplace, became a focal point. Soldiers instinctively gathered around it, not for warmth. It was the middle of a pleasant Bavarian May day, but for its symbolic weight. It was a tangible gift from Mussolini, a monument to the defeated Axis alliance. One American GI, finding a stub of a discarded Nazi military cigarette, lit it using a match struck against the polished marble. The act felt profoundly defiant, sacrilegious even, in this sanctuary of former power. The smell of cheap tobacco and high-quality French liquor now permeated the pure mountain air. Gallagher watched a young French soldier, perhaps 18 years old, carefully extract a small silver crucifix from one of the looted crates in the wine cellar. The young man stared at it, then tucked it into his tunic pocket. This wasn't simple theft. It felt more like retrieval, a personal tax levied against the regime that had inflicted so much damage. The distinction between loot and spoil was becoming hazier by the minute, but the overall feeling was one of rightful inheritance. Major Driesbach, while continuing to catalog the important SS documents, began to realize the full propaganda potential of the location. He radioed headquarters, requesting a photographer and reporters be sent up immediately. This pristine, intact symbol of Nazi arrogance, still smelling of the rich materials used in its construction, was the perfect visual contrast to the ruined Germany below. It was essential the world saw how the rulers had lived while their people starved and died. As the sun began to sink behind the jagged peaks, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished wooden floors, Gallagher thought about the man who had ordered this monument built. Hitler had only visited the Kehlsteinhaus about a dozen times, reportedly due to his fear of heights and the lightning strikes that often hit the exposed peak. The irony was devastating. The ultimate symbol of the thousand-year Reich's mountain stronghold was a magnificent gilded cage that its master barely used, leaving it instead as a perfectly preserved treasure chest for the victorious Allies to plunder and inspect. The war may have ended with a whimper in Berlin, but it was being celebrated with a thunderous toast high above Bavaria. The morning of May 5th brought a new phase to the occupation of the Kehlsteinhaus. A convoy of specialized personnel, including U.S. Army intelligence officers, Signal Corps photographers, and a detachment from the 3rd Army's T-Force, the intelligence gathering unit, made the winding, slow climb up the Kehlstein Road. Among them were historians and translators, men more interested in the intellectual spoils than the material ones. Major Driesbach met them at the entrance to the tunnel, explaining the chaotic scene above. The immediate priority shifted from securing the structure to exploiting its contents. The French, having celebrated their liberation, were cooperative, ensuring the most valuable documents and artifacts were transferred from the celebratory hands of the infantry to the methodical hands of the intelligence corps. The historians focused on the small study. They carefully removed the leather-bound books, looking for annotations or inscribed names that might reveal who had used this high-altitude retreat most frequently, likely Martin Bormann, the powerful head of the party chancellery, who ran the entire Obersalzberg complex. While the historians meticulously examined the papers, the Signal Corps photographers began documenting the sheer excess. Technical Sergeant Eddie Sloan, a photographer with the 3rd Army, set up his tripod in the Great Hall. The light pouring through the panoramic windows was intense, almost theatrical. He framed the shot. The massive Rosso Verona fireplace, now slightly marred by the cigarette ash, contrasted sharply with the mud-stained boots and rifles of the American Guards. He understood Major Driesbach's instinct. The photograph was a perfect visual metaphor for the clash of worlds, the brutal reality of the front line invading the pristine bubble of the Nazi elite. Gallagher and Rizzo were reassigned to act as guides and security for the intelligence teams. They led a translator, Lieutenant Stern, a thin, nervous man of German-Jewish descent, through the kitchen and the adjoining quarters. In a small pantry, they found boxes of preserved goods and luxury provisions, caviar, tins of pâté, and exotic spices. They ate like kings right up to the end, Stern observed grimly, picking up a tin of smoked salmon imported from Norway. The most telling discovery of the morning was made by Gallagher in the small guardroom attached to the main hall. Tucked behind a built-in locker, he found a canvas sack, obviously abandoned in the last seconds of the evacuation. Inside, nestled among uniforms and personal effects, were several bound journals. They weren't Hitler's. They were the personal diaries of a high-ranking SS officer assigned to the complex's security detail, a man named Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter. Gallagher handed the sack to Lieutenant Stern. The translator carefully pulled out the top journal. The handwriting was neat, formal German script. Stern began to skim the entries, his eyes widening. These pages offered not a strategic overview, but a granular eyewitness account of life within the inner circle during the final, frantic months of the war, recording the paranoia, the lavish parties, and the sheer disbelief as the Allies closed in. Lieutenant Stern retreated to a quiet corner of the sun-drenched Great Hall, completely absorbed in the discovery of Hauptsturmführer Richter's journals. The pages detailed not grand strategy, but the mundane details of fanaticism and decay. They painted a picture of the Obersalzberg not as a strategic headquarters, but as a privileged bubble clinging desperately to denial. Stern translated key passages for Major Driesbach, his voice low and intense. Richter's entry from January 1945 detailed a New Year's reception held at the nearby Berghof, Hitler's primary residence, now mostly destroyed by bombing. Noting the extraordinary amounts of food and French champagne consumed while news of the desperate fighting in the Ardennes was being censored from the guests. January 1st, 1945. The Führer was absent, but Reichsleiter Bormann presided. The gaiety was forced, thin like ice over a deep pond. We celebrated our anticipated victory, while the radio reported only good news. But the staff whispers tell a different, grimmer tale. Yet the wine flows. How can men speak of total war while drinking Bollinger and eating fresh sturgeon? Another passage, dated late April, was far more frantic. It described the sudden orders to evacuate the Kehlsteinhaus, with only essential documents to be saved. The focus was on personal safety and the preservation of personal wealth, rather than any attempt to mount a defense. April 26, 1945. The final day. The Americans are closer than they admit. Bormann's order. Save the gold and the files, leave the rest. The sight of our officers desperately stuffing Swiss francs into their tunics, forgetting to take even the strategic maps, was utterly degrading. This monument, built for eternity, is abandoned to the thunder of their guns. We leave the wines. We leave the art. They will never know the value of what we leave behind. The journal confirmed the Americans' suspicion. The speed of the Allied advance and the total breakdown of the chain of command meant the retreat was not orderly. The SS troops, whose oath was to the Führer unto death, had fled, abandoning priceless artifacts and, more importantly, detailed intelligence about the inner mechanisms of the collapsing regime. Richter's words provided not just facts, but emotional context. The utter disillusionment and moral bankruptcy of the men tasked with protecting the last symbols of the Reich. The discovery was critical. The journals helped intelligence confirm the key individuals who had been at the Obersalzberg in the final days, aiding the immediate manhunt for figures like Bormann and the remaining high-ranking SS officers. It transformed the Kehlsteinhaus from a mere trophy into a crucial intelligence node, an unlocked diary of the Nazi twilight. As Lieutenant Stern continued to analyze the SS diaries, the intelligence teams began the exhaustive, formal inventory of the Kehlsteinhaus contents. The task was complex, involving not just listing items, but attempting to trace their origin. A process that involved contacting Allied art recovery specialists and representatives of various occupied nations. The focus shifted heavily to the concealed crates Gallagher had discovered in the wine cellar. When the oilcloth protecting the rolled-up canvases was removed, art specialists gasped. They were looking at masterpieces, works by Dutch masters, Impressionist pieces confiscated from private Jewish collections in Paris, and Renaissance paintings taken from Italian museums after Mussolini's fall. The value was incalculable, representing a minuscule fraction of the vast, state-sponsored looting conducted by Reichsleiter Alfred Rosenberg's Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR organization. Major Driesbach stood over a table covered in a collection of gold and silver religious artifacts. A French officer, Captain Dubois, pointed to a tarnished silver reliquary. This, Dubois stated, his voice heavy with significance, is from the treasury of a very old church in Lyon. It was reported stolen in 1941. We can confirm its provenance immediately. The Kehlsteinhaus, perched high on the mountain, functioned as a symbolic endpoint for these stolen goods. It represented the regime's final, desperate attempt to hold onto its ill-gotten gains. The items were not randomly acquired. They were selected for their historical, artistic, or financial value, intended perhaps to be the crown jewels of a vast, post-victory museum in Linz, or to be sold off to finance clandestine post-war operations. Meanwhile, the celebrations among the troops continued in a more subdued manner. The initial, euphoric consumption of wine was now replaced by the grim business of processing the spoils. The French troops, in particular, took a personal interest in cataloging the remaining French wines and brandies, treating each bottle not as an opportunity for drink, but as an object of national retrieval. Staff Sergeant Gallagher found himself talking to Technical Sergeant Sloan, the photographer. Sloan was preparing a new angle, focusing on a display of expensive and used Baccarat crystal glassware, still in its packing straw, next to a stack of German Wehrmacht helmets discarded by the fleeing guards. "The visual is all here, Sarge," Sloan noted, peering through his viewfinder. The total disconnect. They lived in this bubble of crystal and marble, convinced they were superior, while their world was being blown to hell. Gallagher simply nodded, leaning against the red marble fireplace. The sheer volume of material evidence proved what they had always known. The war was not just about territory. It was about the systematic, criminal exploitation of a continent. And here, in Hitler's mountain retreat, they had captured the definitive, untouched evidence. The sheer completeness of the discovery, the documents, the art, the wine, the preserved state of the architecture, led the intelligence officers to see the Kehlsteinhaus less as a fortress and more as a detailed blueprint of the Nazi elite's internal psychology. A magnificent, isolated monument to denial. Major Driesbach gathered his key personnel, including Lieutenant Stern and Sergeant Gallagher, for a briefing inside the Great Hall, which was still bustling with inventory teams. He pointed to the panoramic windows, which offered a breathtaking, yet isolated view of the world. "Look around you," Driesbach instructed. This place was built to separate the leadership from reality. Down there, Berchtesgaden is smashed. Across the valley, the Reich is dead. But up here, the air is clean, the glass is spotless, the wine is chilled. They built this to prove they were above the war, untouched by the consequences of their own decisions. He explained that the design, overseen heavily by Martin Bormann, had a specific purpose. Hitler rarely used the retreat, but its existence was crucial. It was a symbol of absolute security and prestige, meant to impress visiting dignitaries, and, perhaps more importantly, to reassure the inner circle that their position was unassailable. The Kehlsteinhaus was not about defense, it was about performance. The 124-meter tunnel and the gilded elevator, the very elements that made access difficult, were not fortifications but theatrical props. This perception was borne out by the minor details Gallagher noticed. In the guard quarters, he found personal letters written by the SS guards, not about military strategy, but about their anxieties regarding their future wives and children, coupled with fierce, written denunciations of the defeatist elements in Berlin. Even at the lowest level of the complex's security, there was a profound disconnect, a desperate need to cling to the myth of victory while surrounded by the evidence of imminent defeat. The historians confirmed that the furnishings, including the massive, circular bronze lighting fixtures and the heavy oak tables, were all custom-made at staggering cost, diverting resources needed for the front lines. The famous red marble fireplace, the gift from Mussolini, was itself a symbol of a decaying alliance, now standing silent witness to the end of the Axis dream. The work now began to focus on the structure itself. Engineers began mapping the surrounding service tunnels and accessways, searching for any hidden safes or deep bunkers that might contain the legendary, missing Nazi gold or crucial final orders. The discovery of the retreat was transitioning from a moment of drunken celebration to a methodical, cold-blooded intelligence operation, seeking to extract every last piece of the Third Reich secrets from its last, pristine refuge. The intelligence team's primary concern now was not what they could see, but what was deliberately hidden. Given the vast network of bunkers and tunnels constructed beneath the nearby Berghof, it was highly probable that the Kehlsteinhaus complex extended far beneath the reception house itself. Engineers from the U.S. Third Army began running sensitive magnetic and sonic scans of the floors and surrounding rock face. The only obvious subterranean access was the long, horizontal marble tunnel leading to the elevator and the adjacent service passages used by the fleeing SS guards. Following these rough-hewn service tunnels, Staff Sergeant Gallagher and an engineering team began to map the lower levels. The contrast was stark. The luxurious marble and brass of the main route gave way to wet, dripping granite and rough concrete, smelling strongly of sulfur and stale water. They discovered a secondary series of chambers beneath the elevator shaft, designed for maintenance and utilities, power generators, ventilation systems, and large water cisterns. Everything was built to be self-sufficient, capable of sustaining the summit occupants for weeks, even during siege conditions. This was the real fortress, the operational backbone hidden beneath the theatrical facade. In one large, dry chamber, they found evidence of hurried destruction. Hundreds of empty canisters of photographic film and burnt documents were scattered across the floor, mixed with the residue of hastily demolished radio equipment. This suggested that a specialized team had been here very recently, tasked with destroying sensitive communications logs and imagery, a clear indication that crucial secrets had been evacuated or incinerated in the final hours. It was here, in the damp, utilitarian gloom, that they found the final, poignant evidence of the SS retreat. Tucked into a ventilation shaft, Gallagher found a discarded uniform jacket belonging to Hauptsturmführer Richter, the SS officer whose journals Lieutenant Stern was translating. The jacket was empty, suggesting the officer had changed into civilian clothes for his escape, abandoning the uniform that symbolized his fanatical loyalty. While Gallagher's team mapped the utility chambers, Major Driesbach received an initial assessment of the recovered artwork. The news was both sobering and thrilling. Several of the recovered paintings, when unrolled, were identified as belonging to the collection of the famous Jewish art dealer Paul Rosenberg of Paris. The recovery was not just a historical victory. It was a deeply personal act of justice for the victims of the Holocaust. The mountain retreat, once a symbol of the conqueror's arrogance, was now a crucial link in restoring a fraction of what had been lost. While the engineers worked below, the intelligence teams continued their detailed sweep of the main structure. The kitchen, often overlooked, became a point of interest for Lieutenant Stern and a U.S. quartermaster officer, Lieutenant Harris. The kitchen was surprisingly large and incredibly modern for the 1930s, featuring massive copper ovens, stainless steel work surfaces, and a specialized pantry for cold storage. It was designed to cater grand receptions, not simple family meals. Lieutenant Harris, inspecting the remaining stores, found a manifest ledger tucked into a drawer beneath a spice rack. It was the inventory log for all provisions delivered to the Kehlsteinhaus in the final months. The entries were chilling. They detailed specific deliveries of luxury goods, Norwegian smoked salmon, Dutch cheeses, and crates of premium coffee, delivered as late as April 20th, 1945, Hitler's final birthday. This was days after the Soviets had already begun encircling Berlin, illustrating the extreme detachment of the Obersalzberg elite. They were planning a party, Harris observed, running his finger down the last few entries. They were stocking up for a siege, maybe, but a luxury siege. Look at this, Stern. 60 kilograms of fresh butter, French origin. Received 5 days before the bombs dropped. Stern, however, was drawn to the large, custom-built kitchen table, a massive slab of dark wood scarred by preparation work. He noticed a scrap of paper pinned beneath a sugar bowl, a simple grocery list hastily written in a woman's hand, listing items like fresh eggs, milk, and specialty Bavarian bread. It was a domestic note that jarred violently with the high-level treason and fanaticism that had characterized the house. It was a brief, sudden glimpse of the human, mundane life that had existed within this architectural monument to madness. It was in the cold storage pantry that they found the final, grim tableau. The pantry, kept at a constant, icy temperature, held rows of half-eaten preserves and aging game. But on a stainless steel shelf, neatly wrapped in white linen, lay the remnants of a meal. Not a grand banquet, but a simple, final supper, quickly abandoned. A silver tray held the crusts of dark bread and a small piece of processed meat, possibly Bierschinken. The quartermaster officer, trained to see logistics, noted the detail. The serving tray was solid silver, bearing the engraved initials of Hermann Göring, who also had a nearby residence. The simplicity of the abandoned food, served on the opulence of stolen silver, spoke volumes about the panic of the final hour. The German High Command, who had starved a continent, fled their untouched sanctuary, leaving behind the immediate, stark evidence of their hasty retreat. A final, unfinished meal in their golden cage. The methodical cataloging of the Kehlsteinhaus contents continued, but for the soldiers who had fought their way up the mountain, men like Staff Sergeant Gallagher and Private First Class Rizzo, the psychological impact of the discovery was profound and lasting. This was not a burnt-out ruin like the rest of the Obersalzberg complex. It was a perfectly preserved bubble, an echo chamber of the enemy's self-deception. Gallagher stood near the massive, rounded windows of the Great Hall, watching the movement of the technical teams. The sight of the Italian marble fireplace, the Austrian oak furniture, and the French crystal contrasted sharply with his own memories of the war. The frozen foxholes of the Ardennes, the pulverized towns of Normandy, and the grim discoveries of the concentration camps they had recently helped liberate. The distance between the war fought by the foot soldier and the war conceived by the leaders had never been so visually stark. "It's like they thought they were going to win, right up to the minute we showed up," Rizzo remarked, nursing a tin cup of coffee. All the French brandy had been sequestered by the inventory teams, though not before a considerable amount had been consumed. He was looking at a small, almost insignificant detail. A pristine copy of the official Nazi Party newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, lying on a side table, dated April 29th. The headlines still spoke of ultimate German victory and the heroic defense of Berlin. The French troops felt a particular brand of vindication. Lieutenant Moreau recounted to Major Driesbach how his unit had found dozens of empty, high-quality leather suitcases in the basement of a nearby abandoned SS barracks. They were packed and ready for the next move, Monsieur le Major, Moreau explained. They had no plan for defeat, only for relocation. This house, this mountain, was their imagined refuge until the tide turned again. The most jarring psychological discovery was the simple, everyday nature of the luxury. The high thread count linens in the guest bedroom, the expensive imported soaps in the washroom, the perfectly maintained gardens just outside the main terrace, maintained by forced labor, the intelligence reports later confirmed. All spoke to a life completely insulated from the terror and destruction the regime had unleashed. The enemy they had fought was not just militarily formidable. They were also utterly decadent, hypocritical, and ruthlessly privileged. This mountain sanctuary served as the physical proof of the moral distance between the Nazi leadership and the rest of humanity. It galvanized the soldiers, turning their initial exhaustion into a potent, final sense of righteous victory. They had not just defeated an army. They had invaded and dismantled a delusion. The French claim and the international incident. The victory celebration and the subsequent intelligence gathering at the Kehlsteinhaus were abruptly interrupted by the arrival of a high-ranking contingent from the French army. This was not the small reconnaissance group of Lieutenant Moreau, but a formal delegation, complete with general staff officers and military police, sent directly from General Leclerc's headquarters. The goal was singular, to formally assert the French claim over the Obersalzberg complex, specifically focusing on the retrieval of the vast quantities of French national treasure, particularly the wine and the high-value art. The French felt a proprietary, national right to the spoils found here, arguing that since the looted goods originated from France, their immediate custody should revert to the Free French forces. A tense, formal standoff occurred in the sun-drenched Great Hall. A French colonel, Major Driesbach's superior, firmly stated, through a translator, "Monsieur le Major, the wines, the art, the silverware, this is proof of the systematic theft from the people of France. General Leclerc has given explicit orders. These materials are to be secured by the 2E Division Blindé and repatriated immediately to Paris." Driesbach, fully aware of the protocols governing joint Allied operations, and the explicit U.S. Army orders to process the location as a military intelligence site, stood his ground. "Colonel, these are designated war material and intelligence assets. They must be logged by the T-Force and routed through Allied channels for proper restitution to all claimant nations, not just France. We have documented art here stolen from collections across Europe, not solely French property." The friction was a microcosm of the complex political realities emerging among the Allies in the final hours of the European war. The spirit of shared victory was now competing with the scramble for tangible assets and national prestige. The sight of two Allied officers arguing vehemently over cases of Chateau Haut-Brion and crates of Renaissance drawings, all taking place under the gaze of Hitler's empty mountain retreat, was bizarre. Eventually, a compromise was struck, mandated by a flurry of urgent radio messages to higher command. A joint U.S.-French-British team would be formed on site to inventory and secure the loot. But the French delegation insisted on immediately taking custody of the bulk of the French wine collection. The sight of French trucks rolling up the Kehlstein Road, being loaded with hundreds of cases of liberated vintage, was the final, triumphant act for the French forces. The Americans watched, some grudgingly, but others with a sense of understanding. After 4 years of brutal occupation, the French were reclaiming a small piece of their national identity from the symbolic heart of their tormentor. The sight of French trucks rolling up the Kehlstein Road, being loaded with hundreds of cases of liberated vintage, was the final, triumphant act for the French forces. The Americans watched, some grudgingly, but others with a sense of understanding. After 4 years of brutal occupation, the French were reclaiming a small piece of their national identity from the symbolic heart of their tormentor. Section 16. Securing the symbol of arrogance. With the major political friction over the immediate spoils managed, the focus returned to the long-term status of the Kehlsteinhaus. Major Driesbach, following new orders from the U.S. 7th Army, was tasked with physically securing the site and determining its eventual fate. The building, having escaped the general bombardment, was too potent a symbol to be left unguarded, or worse, to fall into the hands of German nationalist elements seeking to turn it into a shrine. Staff Sergeant Gallagher was given the unenviable task of commanding the initial long-term security detail, a small, mixed platoon of American and assigned French military police. Their duties extended beyond simply preventing looting. They were to control access, particularly from the growing influx of curious journalists and opportunists making the pilgrimage up the mountain. The engineers completed their sonic scans of the subterranean levels. They confirmed the existence of a deep, naturally occurring fissure near the elevator shaft that had been structurally reinforced by the Nazis, but no evidence of a further engineered bunker system beyond the existing utility rooms and service tunnels. The legendary last vault of the Reich was not here, at least not in this immediate structure. The Kehlsteinhaus was exactly what it appeared to be: a theatrical mountain retreat, not a command post or a final treasury. This realization solidified the house's role as a symbol. It contained intelligence, the documents and journals, and wealth, the art and wine. But its true value was its photographic and historical proof of the Nazi delusion. Technical Sergeant Sloan and his photography team spent 3 more days on the summit, meticulously cataloging every room, every piece of furniture, and every angle of the spectacular view. During this time, Gallagher often found himself standing alone on the terrace, watching the valleys below. The war was officially over in Italy and the collapse in Germany was total, but the responsibility of holding this particular piece of real estate was heavy. The air was silent, save for the wind. He reflected that the men who had planned the conquest of Europe from the valley below had chosen this remote, inaccessible peak not for its strategic value, but for its psychological power. It was meant to be unassailable, a metaphor for the permanence of the 1,000-year Reich. Now it was occupied by American infantry and French military police, sipping coffee, guarding the remnants of a criminal enterprise. The final, symbolic conquest of the Nazi regime was complete, not with a massive battle, but with an elevator ride and the discovery of a well-stocked wine cellar. Now it was occupied by American infantry and French military police, sipping coffee, guarding the remnants of a criminal enterprise. The final, symbolic conquest of the Nazi regime was complete, not with a massive battle, but with an elevator ride and the discovery of a well-stocked wine cellar. While the Kehlsteinhaus remained largely intact and became the temporary focus of Allied intelligence and media, the fate of the nearby Berghof, Hitler's primary, lower-level residence on the Obersalzberg, provided a dramatic counterpoint. The Berghof was the true headquarters, the place where the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union had been planned, and where appeasement treaties had been signed. Unlike the pristine eagle's nest, the Berghof had been utterly devastated. On April 25, 1945, the RAF Bomber Command launched a massive raid, over 300 Avro Lancasters and Mosquitoes, targeting the entire Obersalzberg complex. The Berghof itself took several direct hits and was gutted by fire. A separate U.S. task force was assigned to investigate the ruins of the Berghof simultaneously with the Kehlsteinhaus operation. Staff Sergeant Gallagher and Private Rizzo were temporarily detached to assist the Berghof team. They descended the mountain from the eagle's nest, moving from the isolated perfection of the high peak to the scorched, smoking rubble below. The scene was one of apocalyptic destruction. Where the Berghof had stood, there was now only a cratered shell, walls blackened and collapsed inward. The once famous panoramic window, where Hitler often received guests, was a jagged gap in the ruins. The immense bunker system beneath the residence, however, was a labyrinthine puzzle. While the structure above was destroyed, the concrete bunkers, built deep into the mountain, had largely survived the tremendous weight of the bombs. Rizzo, picking through the debris of what had been Hitler's study, found only fragments. A piece of a smashed bust of Richard Wagner, and a small, charred section of a globe, its mapping lines burned away. The contrast with the Kehlsteinhaus was immediate and staggering. The Berghof symbolized the military and political defeat, loud, fiery, and complete. The eagle's nest, however, symbolized the moral and material depravity. Quiet, untouched, and utterly exposed. The intelligence teams focused on the Berghoff's bunker complex, searching for the records they suspected had been moved there from Berlin in the final weeks. They found the air thick with soot and concrete dust. The tunnels were dark and unstable, evidence that the SS had attempted to seal them off with demolition charges during their retreat. The real secrets, the command files, and the financial records of the vast Obersalzberg operation would likely be found not in the Eagle's Nest, but deep within the ruins of the Berghoff's concrete tomb. The high-altitude trophy was spectacular, but the charred remains below held the administrative keys to the whole criminal operation. The search inside the surviving lower levels of the Berghoff's massive bunker system proved to be far more physically demanding, yet intellectually rewarding, than the clean sweep of the Kehlsteinhaus. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of damp concrete and ash. Engineers had to work slowly, bracing collapsed ceilings and dismantling hasty demolition roadblocks left by the fleeing SS. The teams, including Major Driesbach and Lieutenant Stern, finally breached a heavily reinforced door leading to a large, dry storage area deep within the complex. Unlike the personal effects left at the Eagle's Nest, this area was filled with bureaucratic evidence. Hundreds of steel filing cabinets, some overturned, but many still locked and intact. This was the Obersalzberg's Central Administrative Archive, a critical collection of documents related to the daily operation of the complex and, potentially, the Reich Chancellery's activities in southern Germany. Lieutenant Stern and a team of translators immediately began the painstaking process of opening and sorting the files. They found detailed financial ledgers, procurement orders for the vast construction projects across the Obersalzberg, and, most critically, personnel records for the entire SS security and domestic staff. These records included real names, addresses, and family contacts, providing the Allied forces with a crucial blueprint for tracing personnel now gone underground. In a heavy safe concealed behind a stack of military-grade rations, they found a collection of files marked Geheim, secret. These files contained detailed blueprints of other secret installations in the region and, most significantly, a substantial collection of correspondence from Martin Bormann to various regional Gauleiters concerning the transfer of Reich assets, specifically industrial machinery and cash reserves, into the so-called Alpine Fortress region in the final months. This paper trail confirmed the Nazi leadership's desperate, last-ditch attempt to create a defensible stronghold and protect their financial resources for a future resurgence. Gallagher, helping to clear rubble near the safe, found a small, leather-bound volume tucked into a crevice. It was a diary not of a high-ranking officer but of an accountant, a Herr Schmidt, who had worked in the Obersalzberg finance office. His entries were dry and detailed, focusing on numbers, the flow of funds, the exchange rates of foreign currency, and the massive transfers of gold bullion to destinations that were frustratingly cryptic. The difference between the two sites was clear. The Kehlsteinhaus offered a spectacular visual trophy and the psychological profile of the enemy's ego. The Berghoff bunkers, in contrast, provided the administrative spine of the criminal enterprise, the dry, meticulous records of who, what, and where the Reich's final assets were being hidden. The mountain complex was not just a retreat. It was an organizational hub, and the Allies now held the keys to its final, chaotic paper trail. The mountain complex was not just a retreat. It was an organizational hub, and the Allies now held the keys to its final, chaotic paper trail. The diary recovered by Gallagher, the ledger belonging to Herr Schmidt, the Obersalzberg accountant, initially seemed dull, a litany of numbers and supply chains. But Lieutenant Stern quickly realized the volume contained coded information essential to tracking the vast, missing wealth of the Third Reich. Schmidt was not detailing payroll. He was logging the high-level transfer of Reichsmarks, foreign currency, and gold. The entries for April 1945 were the most critical. Schmidt had recorded massive disbursements, using cryptic internal code names instead of specific destinations. One entry, dated April 24th, read, $125,000 transferred to Zeus via Sperrgebiet 2 clearance. Stern, working with Major Driesbach, identified Sperrgebiet 2 as a code for a high-security zone in the Austrian Alps, deep in the anticipated Alpine Fortress. Zeus, however, was unknown. The dry, obsessive nature of the accountant's entries provided an unexpected benefit. The codes were consistent. Schmidt had a system. By cross-referencing this ledger with the captured SS personnel records from the Berghof bunkers, Stern discovered that Zeus was likely the code name for a specific, high-ranking functionary within the Reichsbank, German central bank, who specialized in foreign exchange and the transfer of looted bullion. The Allies now had a target, a possible living key to the hidden financial network. Meanwhile, the Kehlsteinhaus itself, high above, was being stripped of its remaining material treasures. The valuable furniture, the Rosso Verona marble fireplace, and the Baccarat crystal were carefully crated by the intelligence teams. They were not to be viewed as common loot, but as historical evidence of war crimes and the corruption of the regime. The fireplace, in particular, was disassembled with precision, its components meticulously labeled for shipment. The process was slow and methodical. Gallagher watched as the last remnants of luxury were removed from the golden cage. The act of crating the furniture, the removal of the polished wood and velvet, was arguably more destructive to the Kehlsteinhaus's symbolic power than the heaviest bomb. The building, once the epitome of unassailable prestige, was being physically dismantled and catalogued, transformed into museum exhibits that would forever testify to its owner's defeat. The mountain retreat was losing its identity as a residence and gaining a new, permanent identity as evidence. By mid-May 1945, the Kehlsteinhaus stood high on the peak, an empty, hollowed-out shell. Its material wealth was crated and heading for collection points in Munich and Paris, and its intelligence had been fully exploited. The last American and French infantry details were preparing to depart, leaving the site in the hands of a small, permanent U.S. military police detachment, backed by a contingent of engineers. The question of the Kehlsteinhaus's ultimate fate became a subject of high-level Allied debate. For some, particularly the Soviet and French delegates, the structure should be immediately demolished, a total erasure of the final symbol of the Reich's power. For the Americans and British, however, there was a growing recognition of its unique value as a historical monument to the defeat. They argued that its pristine condition, contrasted with the ruins of Berlin and the Berghof, made it a compelling witness. The U.S. Army decided on a pragmatic compromise. They would seal the Kehlsteinhaus, restricting all civilian access while maintaining military control. The marble tunnel entrance was secured with heavy steel doors and locked. The ornate brass elevator was deactivated and its components safeguarded. The mountain road, already hazardous, was placed under military guard. The intention was not preservation but neutralization, to prevent the mountain retreat from becoming a dangerous pilgrimage site for residual nationalist elements. Staff Sergeant Gallagher and Private First Class Rizzo were among the last combat troops to leave the summit. As Gallagher descended the long, winding road for the final time, he looked back at the Kehlsteinhaus, gleaming cold and white against the dark, imposing rock of the peak. It was a spectacular, almost unreal sight. Rizzo, having traded his bar for a pack full of expertly bartered German souvenirs, mostly small flags and insignia, but no Kehlsteinhaus crystal, was quiet. "It was weird, Sarge," he finally said, climbing into the back of a canvas-covered GMC SKW truck. "We fought through Italy and France, freezing our butts off, living in the dirt. And this whole time, this guy had a palace up in the clouds, full of French booze, waiting for him. It just doesn't sit right." Gallagher, staring at the retreating peak, understood. The true shock of the eagle's nest was not the battle they hadn't fought, nor the treasure they had found. It was the total, obscene separation of the leadership from the consequences of their war. The Kehlsteinhaus would stand empty for years, an involuntary monument to that final, arrogant delusion, forever preserved in its high, inaccessible isolation. If this story resonated with you, consider giving the video a like. Your support helps us continue bringing important chapters of World War II to light. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next historical journey. Every story we share carries lessons that remain meaningful even today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans countries and generations, connected by a shared desire to understand how history continues to shape our world.